If the world feels more contested, more fragmented, and, frankly, a lot more tense lately, you're not wrong. There's a fundamental rewiring happening in global politics, a real shift away from the rules we all thought we knew. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on this new reality and explore how the logic of power is making a dramatic comeback.
For decades, the big idea was that economic interdependence, countries trading with each other, would naturally lead to peace and cooperation. The more connected we were, the more stable things would be. But that whole assumption, it's being turned on its head. The new reality is that geopolitics, that raw competition for power and security, is now calling the shots, and it's forcing economics to fall in line.
And this, right here, is the absolute core of the issue. It's a profound reversal. Instead of asking what's most efficient or what's most profitable, nations are now asking, what can we control? What do we need to survive? And what gives us an edge over our rivals? This isn't just a minor tweak, it's a completely different operating system for the world.
Okay, so we've got to get our heads around this term, great power logic. It's basically the idea that for the major states, things like military readiness, control over critical technologies, and the ability to pressure rivals, well, those concerns are moving right back to the center of all their decision-making. It's a colder, much more calculated way of looking at the world.
So you might be wondering, if this logic is so important, where's it been for the last 30 years? Well, the truth is, it never really went away. It was just hiding, masked by a very specific and pretty unusual moment in history.
And this quote just nails it. We mistook a temporary quiet spell for a permanent change in how the world works. We thought we had, evolved beyond old-school power politics, but we were really just living through a brief intermission.
And these were the conditions that created that illusion. You had the US as the undisputed sole superpower, a pretty weakened Russia, and a China that was still very much focused on its internal rise. There just wasn't much room for a big geopolitical rivalry. And that period, it wasn't the new normal. It was actually an anomaly in the grand sweep of history. And that powerful belief that we could tame any lingering ambitions for power just by connecting the world through trade, well, that assumption has now been shattered.
And that illusion wasn't just shattered, it was shattered violently with the return of large-scale, old-fashioned territorial war in Europe.
I mean, this single event sent a message to the entire world. It was a brutal reminder that a major state could and would choose its perceived security needs, its imperial memories, and its strategic position over any semblance of economic rationality. Just like that, the spell was broken.
And all of a sudden, these terms, which sounded like they belonged in a 19th century history book, were right back in the headlines. Russia's actions reintroduced this older grammar of power, reminding everyone that changing borders by force, what's called coercive revision, was once again on the table. The world was forced to relearn a language it had tried very hard to forget.
This just reframes the entire idea of interdependence, doesn't it? For years, Europe's reliance on Russian energy was seen as a good thing, a stabilizing force. But under the harsh light of war, that exact same connection was revealed for what it truly was, a critical vulnerability, a tool for blackmail. A very, very painful lesson.
But Russia's approach, this direct, violent challenge to the system, that's just one version of this returning logic. There's a far more complex and maybe more consequential version playing out between China and the US. And it's not happening by breaking the system from the outside, but by competing for control from deep within it.
This table lays out the contrast so clearly. Where Russia has acted as a disruptive power, trying to smash the existing order with force, China is a whole different kind of challenge. It rose by mastering the globalized system, and now it wants to reshape that very system to serve its own strategic ambitions.
And that is the huge twist in the globalization story we were all told. The belief was that by welcoming China into the world economy, its ambitions would soften and it would start to look more like the West. Instead, that very integration gave China the resources, the technology, and the sheer scale to pursue its ambitions on a global stage.
So, if the game has changed, what are the new rules? What are the tools being used in this era of competition? Well, it turns out they're the very tools of globalization themselves, just repurposed for strategic ends.
Look at these. They're not rare exceptions to the rule anymore. This is the new normal. Using economic tools for political and security goals, what we call economic statecraft, is now just a regular part of international relations for all major powers, and that includes the United States.
This is such a powerful way to think about it. Supply chains, financial networks,
technology hubs, these are the new strategic battlegrounds. And it's not just the superpowers. Blocs like the European Union and emerging powers like India are quickly developing their own toolkits, mapping out where they're vulnerable, and trying to build their own leverage in this new game.
And this all means that geography is back in a big way. Control over the physical architecture of our connected world, from the sea lanes that carry our goods to the undersea cables that carry our data, has become a massive point of rivalry. Territory still matters for sure, but so do the choke points of the entire global system.
Which brings us to the one word you really need to understand for this new era: leverage. In a world of these complex supply chains, real power comes from controlling something that is indispensable. Think about China's dominance in processing rare earth minerals. They're essential for everything from our smartphones to advanced weapons. That gives them enormous leverage. Find the bottleneck, and you've found the power.
Okay, so we've defined the new logic, we've seen the examples, we've identified the tools. But what does this all mean for how we experience the world? Why does everything feel so much more, well, dangerous? Well, here's why. The world feels more like a raw power contest because the major players are just being more honest and open about it. They're less willing to pretend that mutual benefit is the only thing that matters. The softer language of cooperation is still there, of course, but a harder language of power is being spoken much, much more loudly.
Ultimately, it's a fundamental shift in what everyone cares about. The post-Cold War era was all about a search for efficiency, for deeper integration, for mutual benefit. Today, the focus is increasingly on control, on survivability, and on gaining leverage over your rivals.
Now, it's easy to look at all this and just see chaos. But this isn't the end of order. It's really the end of a very specific, and maybe a little bit naive, story we told ourselves about where the world was headed. The world is simply returning to something more like its historical average, a state where power is acknowledged much more openly.
And that leaves us with a really critical question for the future. As nations increasingly prioritize security and control over pure economic efficiency, what trade-offs are we all going to have to make? A more secure world might also be a less prosperous, less open, and a more expensive one. Thinking through that price, well, that's the great challenge of our time.